Okay, now, as you can see, we have online is Thomas Kattau. Thomas, the Deputy Executive Secretary in the Pompidou Group for the Council of Europe. And Thomas is going to give us an interesting perspective which is emerging around a human rights approach on the issues related to drugs. Thomas, thank you for joining us. And just at the start, if we, you have 15 minutes, and we really appreciate your time, by the way. Really appreciate it. And if you can stick strictly to the 15 minutes, because we want to allow time to ensure people have time to deliberate and ask some questions back. And I know you'll be able to join us for the panel discussion. I appreciate that. So 15 minutes, over to you, Thomas.
Good morning, Bela Cleared from Strasbourg. Mr. Chairman, members of the Assembly, esteemed colleagues. You have heard about the risks associated with narcotic drugs. You have heard how the international community since 1961, by adopting international regulations, has embarked on dealing with the risks, the public health risks, to ensure healthier, safer societies. This was the aim of the international regulations, which actually took the drastic steps to schedule certain substances, as you know, and make them illegal for production, distribution, possession, and use. The criminal law is the ultimo ratio and therefore is a very strict measure to deal with risks. And we have now seen over the decades since the 1960s that not only have there been many positive efforts in seizing substances and raising awareness about the risks, but we have also seen that there have been many unintended adverse effects emerging. And these often come in situations when you try to secure public safety, public health and safety by repressive measures, because you tend to enter the sphere of human rights. And here is where I would like to allow me to share my screen so I can accompany my intervention with a few slides. I do expect this is working. Can I have a confirmation?
That's good. Yeah, you can go. Yeah, you can go into kind of
slide
slide
screen
mode.
Working?
If you can go into slideshow mode, it would help. Just put the full slide, Thomas.
I have tried to. Is it the full slide?
That's
now?
perfect. That's perfect.
Excellent. Thank you. So, how come that human rights, which have always been at the heart of drug policy in terms of the tension I've mentioned between the rights of the individual and the need for public health and safety, how come that they have become more prominent recently? Because in the beginning, human rights was not an issue of debate. It was basically prohibition which was at the core of the debate. But for the past 20 years, human rights have gained more prominence. And actually the Pompidou Group of the Council of Europe, with its human rights-based mandate, has been pushing for this. But it was not until the United Nations General Assembly on drugs in 2016 that it really was formalized as an issue of primary concern as importance by the global community. So how come that human rights all of a sudden gained this prominence? Well, first of all, there has been more awareness and understanding about the drug-related harms, not only in terms of the public health risks, but also we have seen the unintended consequences and harms the different repressive policies have created. Needless to say, just to give you one point, if you make one product illegal, it gives rise to illegal markets, organized crime, etc., all the way down to the consequences of criminalizing behavior that entails consequences for societies and individuals alike. And the second element, which I think is more important, is that the debate around drugs has become more widely reaching an informed population, is because of the new media. We have a much more wider range of media, a much more wider range to engage in conversations. And this means civil society could engage in the dialogue much more widely and intensively. And last but not least, there has been more cost-benefit thinking emerging. We have been investing in supply reduction over the past 40 years, immense amounts of money, but at the same time, the world drug problem has not reduced. On the contrary, we have seen the figures of prevalence and production increasing. So for many policymakers, the question arises, was it still worth the investment, or do we have to rethink the cost, not only the cost of investing into supply reduction, but also the cost of the unintended consequences which this entails. In summary, this can be seen as the reason why the human rights debate has gained more prominence, not only amongst civil society organizations and activists, but also on the level of governments and policymakers. Now, when we speak about human rights, very briefly, what are we talking about when it comes to rights? There's a lot of talk about human rights, different understandings. Well, rights are entitlements to certain positive treatment or abstention from treatment towards you. What does this mean? We're speaking about concepts that can be either political, ethical, or legal. And they stem from political declarations. You're all probably familiar with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, which is a political instrument. It is not legally binding in the sense that it gives the individual a legal claim which can be pursued in a court of law. And then you have international conventions that actually create rights and bind governments. These then, again, under national legislation, can also be more specified. You have certain countries who have human rights acts or Bill of Rights, which guarantee rights and specific procedures in a court of law. The key difference is between the political and ethically defined rights with the legal rights, that the legal rights give you a powerful tool actually to challenge treatment, which you have been given a negative sense in a court of law and seek remedy. Or on the other hand, if you are in need of a specific treatment, or if you are having an entitlement to pursue this in a court of law under legal proceedings. Now, while there's different ideas about human rights, what we can see from all international legal instruments, there is consensus, at least, about this list of rights. The right to life, the protection of human dignity, and the list you can see here is enshrined in many international legal instruments, and the European ones mirror the international ones. What are these rights I'm referring to now? What are their specific relevance, or what rights, human rights, are specifically relevant to drug policy? The first is the right to equitable access to healthcare. While there is no such thing as a right to health, that's the bad news, there is, however, a human right to equitable access to healthcare. Then there is the right to information about one's health, including the right not to be informed. There is the right to protection of personal data concerning health. There is the prohibition of medical treatment without consent, which is particularly important because we still see sometimes trend to discuss whether there should be compulsory work as a matter of treatment, imposable work as treatment. Then the prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment, which is also referred to very often as the Council of Europe's Anti-Torture Convention. And of course, the prohibition of compulsory labor, which I've just referred to. These are all enshrined in legal instruments of the Council of Europe. They're binding conventions, and actually they constitute legally enforceable rights for the individual. And this is for everybody who is residing, not only a citizen, for everybody who is residing in a Council of Europe member state. Ireland, for instance, is a member of the Council of Europe. And therefore, in Ireland, as well as in all our other 46 member states, these constitute legally enforceable rights. Just on the margins, I would like to also say that constantly human rights law is evolving. While the conventions enshrine specific articles, we have a European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which is actually developing in the case law more detailed principles in addition to the articles in the convention. And one thing which has been recently emerging, a principle which is endorsed by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, which I find particularly interesting, is that we have now something like a right for civil society participation. For those who are interested lawyers or legally minded, this right flows from two legally enshrined rights in the Convention, the right to freedom of speech and the right to freedom of assembly. These taken together have led to the newly emerged doctrine of civil society participation being right in the political process. Now, the legal principle about the human rights we're speaking about is that the human rights entailed in the conventions that are legally enforceable, they entail restrictions and positive obligations, not for citizens, but for governments. Basically means they create restrictions on what governments can do in the pursuit of their policy goals. Very clearly, for instance, we see this in criminal justice cases, the limitations of what can be done in terms of interrogation, the restrictions as to under what circumstances seizures and arrests can be made, etc., etc. And positive obligations, meaning when governments are obliged to act in the citizen's interest. The classic case here is the access to treatment, for instance, right? So human rights create rights not between one citizen vis-a-vis the other. It creates rights and entitlements towards governments. The challenge for the governments, however, in the pursuit of their policies, and this is where I started my intervention, is that on the one hand, you have to effectively guarantee the rights of the individual, but at the same time, you also have to ensure public health and safety. Public health and safety require sometimes instruments that lead to restriction of individual rights. This is the challenge what governments have to struggle with. It's cutting the balance between these two. Now, the answer to this philosophically clearly is very nice, that you have to cut a fair balance between the demands of the general interest of the community and the protection of the individual's fundamental rights. However, in practice, that is not always easy to handle. More precisely, to give you a couple of examples in my limited time, where in drug policy, the human rights matter particularly, the European Court of Human Rights has established three key principles in terms of availability and access to treatment, which particularly apply to people who use drugs or suffer from drug use related medical conditions. First of all policies must be proportionate, and next, the health system which must be available should be accessible, acceptable, and of sufficient quality. And the third principle in here is that the care in prison should be equivalent to the care made available to society in general. So basically means governments cannot say, for economic reasons, we'll have a scaled down healthcare system in the prisons. The principle established by the European Court of Human Rights is the same medical care which is available to the population must be made available to people in prison. The availability means the existence in sufficient quantity of healthcare services. The accessibility means the ability of people to benefit from services. The acceptability means that it's ethically appropriate and human rights compliant in the way you deliver and set up the services. And quality means that the services, the health services, are not arbitrary and that they are based on medical and scientific evidence and not based on political or budgetary expedience. So the principle of equivalence means detention is the punishment for the crime and not for the worsening of the health. And this is very important argument in terms of ensuring adequate healthcare in prisons, particularly for those who are suffering from drug use related pathologies. In the end, what are the political arguments that drive the human rights agenda? First of all, human rights violations lead to discrimination, which in turn to social exclusion, such as unemployment and marginalization. A lack of harm reduction actually leads to increased public health risks and individual consequences. If treatment is inadequate, we have severe comorbidities, relapse, And if we have disproportionate criminal justice responses, we are creating criminal careers and social outcasts. And if we don't listen to civil society, well, we will very often have inadequate responses that don't really meet the needs of the population and the target groups. And above all, if you don't observe human rights, what we see is you will suffer not only from increased human consequences, but also violation of human rights increases social and financial costs.
Thomas,
Yes,
if I
therefore,
can ask you
the public group
to...
is advocating
Sorry,
for
Thomas,
a balanced approach.
Apologies, Thomas,
A
to
new
cut in.
balanced approach for sustainable drug policy respectful of human rights. Thank you very much.